Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Impunity Observer podcast. Today's guest is Maria Zuppello. Maria is an investigative reporter and expert on the crime terror nexus in Latin America. She worked for The Guardian, AFP, and The Economist. She also writes for the Latin American news outlet Infobae. Maria, although Italian, has lived in Brazil for more than a decade, and she will talk to us about the presidential election in that country. The first round was on October 2nd, and the runoff between Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Jair Bolsonaro, who got the most votes in the first round, will be on October 30th. Welcome, Maria. Was it a surprise that the presidential race ended up being really tight between Lula and Bolsonaro?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Yes, it was a totally surprise. It was a kind of World Cup final. This was the mood that Brazilian people felt last Sunday. It was unexpected because we must advise that for weeks we had polls saying that the big winner would be Lula at the first round for the first time in the Brazilian history. And so the expectations in Brazil and outside Brazil, journalists, voters, analysts, were that something really clear was coming. The victory of Lula, who had a difference of 14 points with Bolsonaro, which means that really nobody could expect a result like the result that we had Sunday. And what happened? It was a kind of, as I said, World Cup final. And we have only 5 points of difference between Lula and Bolsonaro, which means that yes, Lula won the first round, but that now the competition with Bolsonaro will be much more high and difficult for him. Also because the structure of the Congress changed a lot. Don't forget that the Brazilian not only voted for the president, but also for choose the governors and senators and the representative of the House of Representatives. And the biggest news is that Brazil never had a Congress like this one, which means a Congress with an ultra-conservative bloc. The financial market reacted very well to this news. Why? Because to have an ultra-conservative bloc means that even in the case of a Lula victory, Lula government will struggle to implement a radical policy, for example, for economy or for social programs. As you know, when we talk about leftist parties in Latin America, we are not talking about the same left that we have in Europe or in the United States. It's a more radical left that behind has the example of the story of dictators like Chavez and Maduro and very radical experiences like, for example, Cristina Kirchner, Evo Morales in Bolivia. Lula always represented a moderate way of this pink tide that is coming back. The problem is that the world changed after his 2 presidencies starting from 2002, the world changed, and nobody knows what kind of economic policy he wants to implement in Latin America. I want to give you some specific data just to understand what is the Brazil now and what is the economical situation, because I think that if you want to discuss about elections, the most significant data are the economic data. So I'd like that Brazil is growing, and the forecast for the end of the year of this gross domestic product is that it will be above 3%. We need to say that unemployment has dropped after 7 years for the first time below 9%, and inflation will end 2022 at 5.5%, less than that of the European Union. So it's a big result. In addition, Bolsonaro tried to challenge Lula also from a social perspective. He increased the Auxílio Brasil, which is a kind of monthly salary of 600 reais, around $100 more or less, and he wants to increase up to 1,000 reais, which means $200. He also reduced state fuel taxes, so Brazilian gasoline now is one of the least expensive in Latin America. So the problem for Lula will be that Brazilians now need facts. Okay. During all his first part of his campaign, Lula only talked about his past. Under my presidency, everything was perfect. People were rich, had picanha on their table, which is true, but the world was different. Don't forget that we had at the time the boom of commodities. The scenario now is totally different. We have a war in Europe. We have recession everywhere. So people know in Brazil that it would be very hard for Lula to accomplish what is promising. Don't forget that also Brazil is the world's 6th most populous country and the 12th largest economy. So it means that we have a lot of foreign interest in the country about the Amazon, about the commodities, about oil. That's why also in the press, in the foreign press, we can say that people, I mean, foreign people. I mean, I don't know if you read the last analysis of the economists. The economists say Lula will be better than Bolsonaro, but he need to promote a center-focused politics, which will be very hard because, as I say, the Congress is from the Bolsonaro side. So we can say that even if Bolsonaro won't win at the end of the month, September 15th, we can say with absolute clarity that Bolsonarism was the big winner of the elections. I don't know if you want that I can explain the different background, but Bolsonaro and Lula, in my opinion, represent the two faces of Brazil. Don't forget that Brazil is a huge country, bigger twice than Europe, with a lot of inequalities, with a social gap that is impressive. Bolsonaro represents the most conservative side. He comes from the military milieu. He joined the center-right Liberal Party. He tried to forge a coalition with other two large parties, and he got a very good approval rating in the last month. He was hardly criticized during the COVID-19 pandemic because he delayed the purchase of the vaccine. But at the same time, we have to say that we have a governor here in Sao Paulo, Doria, who pushed the Chinese vaccine, CoronaVac. And nobody say that this CoronaVac was a really bad vaccine that Europe didn't buy, United States didn't buy, because there were no data, there were not scientific data to prove that it was a an efficacious vaccine, which means that you have a narration, a narrative of a reality, and then you have the reality. So I agree when people say he could have buy the vaccine before. Yes, it's true. He could have avoided his statements sometimes were really insensitive. I agree. But now I tell you, Brazil has already the third booster, and in Italy we don't have. Everybody here can have the fourth booster, and in Italy we don't have, only old people. So it means that behind the propaganda, we need to look at the facts. For sure, I think that we can say that the Brazilian elections have a big loser, which is the Brazilian citizen. Why? Because Brazilian society wasn't able to produce a third way, okay, something and someone between Bolsonaro and Lula. So the problem is that we are in a polarized situation with two different characters that can be criticized for a lot of reasons, but we don't have a third proposal. That's why I say that probably we need to see in 4 years what's going to happen here in Brazil. But at the moment, we really don't know what's going to happen in 28 days, which is the difference between the first and the second round. So that's the situation. Don't forget that one of the big problems, I mean, in Latin America, I think that it's a global phenomenon, but in Latin America it's stronger, the phenomenon of corruption. Corruption is everywhere in Brazil. Don't forget that Lava Jato, the car wash operation that discovered big bribes for the nation companies like Petrobras, etc. Lava Jato was focused on 53 parties. The party of workers of Lula was one of the most recipients of the bribes, and Lula was involved in it. But for example, now, during the first round of his electoral campaign, his mantra, his lemma was, I was considered innocent even by the United Nations, which actually doesn't mean anything, because it's not the United Nations that can declare a president innocent or not. And it's not correct technically, because he had two trials. The one for Atibaia, which was a personal property, and the second one for his apartment on the triplex, a building in the Sao Paulo state city of Guarujá. These two convictions were not cancelled. They just, how can I say, they just expired because there was a technical strategy to move the trial from Curitiba to Brasilia, which means that they lose a lot of time, and during this time the conviction expired. But nobody say that he was innocent. So this is a lie.
So what happened with the polls, and why did they fail to predict this tight race between Lula and Bolsonaro?
For two main reasons, official main reasons, even if nobody say that. The big problem is that the databases that these polls use are very old databases. The last census in Brazil dates back to 2010. Why? Because in 2020, the new census was cancelled due to the pandemic. So actually, we are talking about old data, and there is one reason more. As you know, here in Brazil, the evangelical population is very important for elections because they represent a very good part of the society. If you read the data from 2010 census, you can say that we had at that time around 42 millions of evangelical people in Brazil. But we don't know, nobody knows if and how this part of population increased. So it means that if evangelical people were traditionally more loyal to the conservative side of the politics, for sure the lack of information played a very big role in the prediction, because we have polls and then you write prediction starting from the poll. And then, in my opinion, and I talk as a European, in Italy, for example, 2 weeks before the election, it's totally forbidden to make polls and to publish polls, because the reason is that is to avoid any kind of interference in the election, in the elector decision. Here, the polls were allowed until the day before the election, so you can imagine. And second, in my opinion, it's a very serious problem. We have different institutions that work with polls. One of them, Datafolia, is owned by the same publishing group that publishes Folha de Sao Paulo, one of the most important daily newspaper in Brazil, which is, it's unbelievable, because you should have an independent media, and then you have polls that are managed by the same group that runs the newspaper. The same for the other institution, IPEC. IPEC is not owned by Globo Group, but the polls were commissioned by Globo. Globo, as you know, in Brazil, which for me is amazing. Brazil doesn't have a public broadcast. They recently started the ABC, but it's really is not representative of Brazilian TV. If you go to Brazil and you ask people what is Brazilian TV, everybody says Globo. They are powerful, but it's a private group with a lot of economical and political interest. And now they are in a very sensitive moment because they are waiting for the government confirmation of the, how do you say in English, concessions, the authorizations to continue to broadcast. So for them to take a position or another one makes the difference. So that's the most important reason. And then you have another factor that was really important, in my opinion, the so-called o voto invergognato, the vote with shame. Brazilians were scared to reveal their vote to the people that asked for polls, and so they prefer to lie instead of saying the truth, which is a very plausible explanation, because Brazil, as Tom being said, is not a country for beginners. It means that you need to put aside all your European mindset, your logical mindset, to understand the deep Brazil, which is much more full of contradictions. And we are seeing it now. Now that the second round campaign started, the market of votes already began, with people like Ciro Gomes, who was one of the other two candidates that got most votes. It was totally against Lula last week, and yesterday he accepted the decision of his party to endorse Lula. So you need to understand that here people change their mind really quickly. And now it will be very interesting to see how the last result, could affect, could interfere in Brazilian perception of a winner. For example, I read many articles from the Brazilian press highlights that there are a lot of people from the financial market that seeing the good results of unexpected results of Bolsonaro last Sunday are changing their mind. So we really can make predictions about September 30, but I can promise that it will be very, very funny and interesting.
Right. And why do you think the October 2 presidential election had such a high absentee rate despite vote being mandatory in Brazil for people 18 or older? So
Yeah,
why?
first of all, in Brazil, people can begin voting at age 16. Okay. But as you said, the vote is mandatory after, age 18. The problem is that, I think that Lula, lose a lot of votes because of, these young people that avoid to vote because they were not obliged. First. Second, Sunday was raining a lot of places in Brazil. And Brazilian is very lazy. I mean, if it rains, the fines to pay are so cheap as R$4 that everyone can afford it. So that's why, in my opinion. And my opinion, this 20% really penalizes Lula. It was a big penalization for Lula. Okay. So I can give this kind of explanation.
Right. And how did Bolsonaro manage to get this relatively good result despite the criticism of his handling of the pandemic and this apparent wear and tear of his administration? Do you think it's just only because of the economic results you said he had, or also because probably uh, there's a fear of Lula and these ghosts that you already said about Bolivarianism and socialism in the rest of the continent?
Listen, I think that the ghost of Hugo Chavez is playing a big role. Don't forget that yesterday, Ortega in Nicaragua endorsed Lula. Don't forget that Snowden Sunday endorsed Lula, tweeted just the name Lula. So when you look at this and you have just a little bit of culture, you say, it could be a problem. The second problem, big problem, is that Lula refused before the first round to show Brazilians his governance plan. The law requires in Brazil that every candidate needs to present his document for his government. Okay. The problem is that Lula decided to avoid a detailed program. It just put on the website of the electoral court just 21 pages that say absolutely nothing about economy. And there were rumors last week about the name of a potential minister of economy, Enrique Reyes, which is a very good name because he was a very good minister. But at the same time, there were other rumors saying that Alexandre Padilla, who is a doctor and is a former health minister here in Brazil, could be a potential candidate for the minister of economy as a minister of economy. That's why after the unexpected results of Bolsonaro Sunday, the financial side of Brazil asked very strongly to know now what is the political plan of Lula. Exactly. This is the problem. I mean, because the big fear is that he can reproduce in his new presidency the same dynamics that brought to the corruption scandal, and at the same time destroy the country, as we see in Peru, for example. We have a lot of problems in Chile, in Argentina. Never mind. I mean, it's terrible. So for sure, Bolsonaro and is trying to push these topics on his political agenda. Bolsonaro is trying to tell his potential voters, be careful because we don't know what Lula wants to do. The big threat is that we're going to become like Argentina. Argentina is a reference that Bolsonaro repeated all the time in his statements, in his conversations with the population on TV. Is a reference because it's recent. So people can really just open it, just Google Argentina and inflation, and they can see with their own eyes what's happening nearby.
And for the candidates, both Lula and Bolsonaro, what will they have to change to attract these new voters? These probably move a little bit to the center, or what do they have to change in order to attract and get these new voters?
Lula is making, in my opinion, a big mistake because he's trying to attract the financial market. He already tried to do this before the first round, choosing as a vice president, potential vice president, Geraldo Alckmin, who is the former Sao Paulo governor. He's a very conservative guy. Probably there are rumors that he belong to Opus Dei. And so everybody was shocked when Lula announced Geraldo Alckmin, who was an enemy, a Lula enemy 4 years before. Now he's his vice. Why? Because he said that with Geraldo Alckmin, he wanted to negotiate with the agribusiness sector. He wanted to negotiate with the most conservative people. The problem is that he failed. So now what he's gonna do? In my opinion, what he's trying to do is to push from inside the votes from evangelical side of the society. Yesterday there was a very, in my opinion, it was ridiculous. There was a famous Satanist here in Brazil that is followed by thousands of people on TikTok. And he said in this live on TikTok that the Satanists endorsed Lula, which created a scandal because it was retweeted and really amplified by social media. In a situation like this, it would be better to ignore. No, Lula campaign strategists decide to write a few lines in a kind of pamphlet saying that Lula is Christian. Lula never talked with the devil, and that never made a deal. Never made a deal with the devil. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So we can say that this campaign is becoming brutal with Lula tried to attract the rich, and Bolsonaro trying to attract more the poor, the poorest in his agenda now. There are more trips to Brazilian slums where he can negotiate and discuss his position just to show that he's really concerned also about this part of the society. So it would be a big show, in my opinion, where these these missing votes will be easily moved from one side to another, depending of very unpredictable circumstances. It will be. We can have a debate. We can have a TV debate, and a TV debate can change again the rules. So I love Brazil because it's an unpredictable country, and what they call the jeitinho brasileiro. It means we wait to resolve everything at the last minute. I think it's really appropriate in this situation. I think that the jeitinho brasileiro will be effective at the last moment, which means Sunday, October 30th.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's all the time we've got, but I would like to thank Maria Zuppello for participating in this episode of the Impunity Observer podcast and everyone who is watching this episode too. Please do not forget to subscribe at impunityobserver.com and to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you very much.